So my union branch called a protest, assessed sort of, you know, risk assessed it, made it really safe, and lawful. Not all protests are banned. People thought they were, but actually my solicitors are quite clear that they're not. It's a proportionate, and you have to balance a number of different rights with the legislation. We called the protest. We deliberately intended for it to be small and not a mass protest. 40 people came, and we had carefully marked out, and they said to me initially that it was okay, the police, and then they said no, it isn't okay, you've got to halt it. So we argued our way up to the Gold Command, who eventually said no, it isn't okay and you have to stop it. So we stopped it, and I made an announcement about why we were stopping it, so that I could explain to people and say really that if you can't protest about the state of the health service through protest, maybe that meant that we had to revert as health workers to striking in order to make our points clear, because that's all that's left to us if you can't protest. And as we were putting everything away and everybody had gone, the police took me to one side and said they were issuing me with a fixed penalty notice, which is like a parking ticket, for the huge sum of £10,000. And really, when you think, you know, Boris Johnson has held a number of unlawful events that were social events, that were parties, that were drinking, and having fun and quizzes and cake and all the rest of it. They weren't anything to do with making the world a better place. They were about congratulating themselves for the mess that they've made. And I think when we see all the people who've died in the last couple of years from COVID that were unnecessary deaths, when we've seen all the people who've been impoverished, when we see the mess that they've chosen to make of the economy, and the fact that they've made ordinary people pay, so there's £50 billion in the hands of the richest 1,000 people, whereas the inflation rate and the cuts made to the poorest has been the most extreme. I think you have to say, not only is he a liar and a cheat and a defender of a system that does that, but he's also someone who has to go. He has to go because of all those things. And the police, we managed to fundraise within a really short amount of time. By the time I got home and had a couple of conversations with people, there was a number of GoFundMe sort of pages set up. And before I'd had my tea, we'd raised enough to actually pay the fine, more than pay the fine. And I think that gave me the confidence to go on. We got ourselves some good solicitors, myself and Pat Gallagher, who was arrested when they tried to put me in a police van because we'd had the cheek to tell the press, who were still there, they're fining me £10,000, who came to film it, which the police thought was causing a disruption. We said, I think it's you that's causing disruption, not us. Refused to get in the police van, so they arrested Pat because I refused to get in the police van, and she held on to my arm. Pat's 5 foot, and she is a 65-year-old nurse who's since retired, and she was deemed a huge threat to the big burly coppers that were surrounding us. They did de-arrest her a short while afterwards, but they did in the short term arrest her, and they issued her with a fine. So we appealed to the High Court for judicial review, and even though they'd had 3 internal investigations, enormous pressure on them to change their minds, the police held out that it was definitely lawful and definitely, until they got the letter from my solicitors. And they have now eventually conceded that it was unlawful to give me a fine, that it wasn't unlawful to protest. Some protests would have been unlawful. Although interestingly, when I was arguing with the police and said, why don't you arrest all the anti-vaxxers who were running around? And they said, oh, because they're really dangerous. They're full of COVID, unlike you. It would be perfectly safe to arrest. And you just think it's a bit like the way that they sort of, you know, send infiltrators into different political groups. They won't infiltrate the far right because they're too violent and criminal, but they do infiltrate left-wing sort of anti-racist campaigners because they're not violent and criminal. And you just think there's something fundamentally wrong with the world that we live in. Anyway, they've now finally agreed with my solicitors a compensation package. So both myself and Pat have got compensation. They've refused to issue an apology, despite my solicitors pressing very hard for that. And you just think, just as we get to sort of, I mean, I'm not sure I want an apology if it's as half-hearted as the one that Boris Johnson has given, both for his parties and for all the unnecessary deaths and misery that he's caused. But I think what it shows is that, that if you want to beat protest laws, you have to stand up, you have to be counted. And in fact, when you do that, what you get is fantastic solidarity from people. I did feel on my own when there was just me there and they said, you're going to get a £10,000 fine. I called Pat over and then sort of shouted over and the cameras came. But as soon as people know, I think we live in a world where people do want to stand together. You stand on a picket line and it's a bit annoying because you can't speak properly because people bit their horns all the time. And I think people want you to fight. People don't like the world you live in. People do want to protest. And I think it's about standing up for the right to protest. The money and the donations that we've made are going to be donated to the Hazard Centre, who have got a campaign looking at how to prevent mental illness and stresses at work. It's clear that the Health and Safety Act says you have to work in a safe environment and you can't come home with a broken leg from work. Similarly, you shouldn't come back with a broken head from work, and yet many of us do come back with broken heads day after day because they batter us with workloads and pressures and bullying and poverty that makes our work lives unmanageable. And we're going to start to organise as trade unionists, as workers, to oppose that. And that's the campaign that I'm donating the money that people donated to. So I think I think that the bad side of it was that I think it made people feel like you couldn't protest. But I think because we've always gone out fighting and I never stopped protesting, despite the fact that I'd had one fine, I didn't stop protesting and I won't stop protesting, because if we don't protest, then we'll never change the world that we live in. And that's why I'll be there on June the 18th in London. I'll be in Saturday at the anti-racism demonstration on the anniversary of George Floyd. That's why we took the knee in Hume every week throughout the first year of lockdown, and we will carry on doing that as long as we need to.
Oh,